He's taken away my constitutional right to speak. And I have to say, I have a gag order. I can't speak about it. Never happened before, ever. Number one. Number two, it's a fake trial. They have no case. And it's been absolutely proven now. They have no case whatsoever. This is Alvin Bragg doing it for political reasons for Biden.
More on Trump's hush money trial in a moment, but first, it's go time for MTG. The long-simmering feud between Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene and Speaker Mike Johnson is set to come to a head this week as the Georgia Republican finally plans to move to force a vote on the GOP leader's ouster. It's all but certain to fail, but what will the vote mean for the GOP conference moving forward? Here to discuss that and more is Julia Manchester, national politics reporter at The Hill. Julia, my friend, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to see you, Michael.
So like I mentioned at the top, Greene's moment is finally here. She's vowing to force a vote on her ouster resolution after months of dangling it over the speaker's head. Two sources tell me that Greene and Johnson are set to meet at 3:30 p.m. this afternoon. Julia, give us a state of play here as this motion to vacate threat appears to come to a head.
Yeah, well, Michael, the state of play is that Marjorie Taylor Greene, obviously doesn't have too much support. She has Paul Gosar and Thomas Massie, two conservative Republicans backing her. But that's pretty much it. I mean, you saw Speaker Mike Johnson fundraising with President Trump this past weekend, and we know that President Trump has very much endorsed him. So we've seen the rest of the conference essentially fall in line, in part because of that. But also, look, this is an election year, and we know that Republicans have a very, very narrow majority, and they have a very steep hill to climb going into November and, running in a lot of those races. So any sort of chaos or dysfunction within the conference could end up, hurting them in the long term. So I think that's what you're seeing Republicans do. But my biggest question is, what's discussed in this meeting? Does she back off or does she continue to push on? It seems like the only plausible reason for why she would continue to push on with this is because of fundraising and to boost her own national name ID.
Yeah, big meeting, 3:30 p.m. this afternoon. We'll have to see what happens. My guess is she says resign or you're going to face this vote, but we'll have to see. Shifting gears a little bit, authority for the FAA lapses on Friday, and Congress is now racing the clock to reauthorize the agency by that deadline. Some lawmakers, though, are warning that a short-term extension may be needed to wrap up consideration of the entire 5-year reauthorization bill. Julia, what's the latest here?
Yeah, so essentially we see lawmakers, sort of different lawmakers saying different things. So Senator John Thune, for example, from Senate Republican leadership has suggested that that short-term extension very well could be needed. However, it's interesting to see Senator Ted Cruz, who's on the Commerce Committee. He has essentially said, he doesn't think there will be a short-term extension needed, that they will be able to, meet the deadline on their own. But this pressure is certainly on, right now, air traffic, airlines in general have been very much in the news. There's been a lot of pressure on the FAA. So this is something we're watching very closely.
Yeah, we'll have to see if Senate magic kicks in and if they can get this done by Friday. If not, that short-term extension looks very likely. Shifting gears again, week 3 of the Trump trial begins today. It was a rocky start for the former president, to put it one way. The judge in the hush money case found that Trump violated a gag order for a 10th time for attacking jurors in the trial, and he was ordered to pay $1,000. And even more than that, Julia, the judge warned that Trump, quote, future violations of its lawful orders will be punishable by incarceration. Not a great start for the former president in week 3 of the hush money trial.
Yeah, not a great start, but we can be, I think without the gag, we don't really know. I'm stumbling here because we don't really know what Donald Trump is going to do. Without the gag order, I think Donald Trump would very much go out there and continue to, blast Juan Merchan and prosecutors and such in this case. But he has been very boxed in because of this. And I think Trump politically could see this as maybe a gift in a way, in terms of throwing red meat to his base, sort of keeping himself in the headlines, being able to rile up the base that way. But at the same time, it does create another headache. And I think the prospect of jail time while you're campaigning for president probably isn't the most productive idea. So, it further boxes Trump in more. And I have to say, when you watch him speak, outside of the courthouse or even, at his rallies lately, he seems very, very frustrated. So a lot of this very much getting to him as he sits day after day in this New York City courtroom.
Yeah, everyone says this election is unprecedented and it may be overused, but it really is the perfect way to explain what's going on right now. Julia, let's hit the campaign trail. There are officially less than 6 months until the November elections. There's some new polling out on the presidential race. A USA Today Suffolk University poll have Biden and Trump tied nationally. An ABC News Ipsos poll has Biden up 4 percentage points among likely voters. And then Decision Desk HQ's average has Trump up by the slimmest of slim margins, 0.4%. Now, national polls, of course, are different from state-by-state surveys, but give us the outlook 6 months out. This is still anyone's game, right?
Absolutely. And, Michael, I've been talking with Republicans and Democrats this morning, about the state of play 6 months out. And I think the general consensus is this is going to be close, no matter how you slice it. And it could come down to the states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. Now, other swing states to watch include Wisconsin, for example, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina. But those 3 key states, if we want to move past the national polling, those are the ones we should really zero in on. Now, Trump in some of these battleground states, according to Decision Desk, is leading Biden by slim margins, but he's leading. And we see that in general, he is leading according to national averages. However, I think this is just one snapshot in time. At this time next month or maybe next week, we could see this flip and Biden will get a lead. I think we are going to be very much on the polar coaster, going up and down, up and down. And you're going to continue to hear campaigns say they don't pay attention to the polls, though they clearly do. So, buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride in terms of, how these candidates are polling and, where they're surging, where they're not surging, et cetera.
It's a noble cause to try to ignore the polls, but it's pretty impossible. Sticking with the campaign trail, Julia, there's reporting at The Hill about the Biden campaign leaning on a longtime ally ahead of the November elections, Hollywood. Names like Howard Stern, Sean Hayes, Will Arnett, Jason Bateman, Mark Hamill have all appeared alongside the president lately. What's the strategy here, and will it be effective? Because as we just noted, it's anyone's race right now.
Yeah, I think there's a few different strategies at play here. Look, getting young people or, figures that are popular with young people. Mark Hamill obviously isn't exactly a spring chicken, but he's Luke Skywalker. Everyone knows him. He's, an example of someone who can really maybe excite the base, especially with those May the 4th memes over the weekend. So they're very much trying to appeal to a younger audience here, but also maybe a broader audience. When people see celebrities they know meeting with President Biden and going to the White House, that draws their attention to the president. So it definitely is able to keep maybe some positive spin in the headlines going forward. Do I think this will ultimately be a deciding factor in the election? No, I think most Americans aren't looking at who celebrities are endorsing, and we know that celebrities tend to lean overwhelmingly Democratic. But this is definitely a way to keep Biden in the headlines, make him seem like he's, in with the young kids, if you will, and relevant in that way.
Taking a look at the other side of the race, former President Trump was meeting with Republican donors over the weekend, where he said President Biden is running a, quote, Gestapo administration. The White House now condemning the remarks in a pretty sharp fashion. What's the latest, Julia?
Well, look, this comes ahead of Holocaust Remembrance Day. It comes as we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism across the country. So remarks like this are going to stir the pot. They're going to get backlash. I think Donald Trump knew what he was saying when he made these remarks. He knows they're going to make headlines. He knows they're going to irk it's going to irk Democrats. So he did it. But it's eyebrow raising for sure. I thought it was interesting moving on to the retreat itself. Number of potential Veep stakes candidates or vice presidential candidates, including Tim Scott, Marco Rubio, Kristi Noem, et cetera, were in attendance at that fundraiser, which I think was a major takeaway from that. So, I'm curious to see when Trump finally makes that decision.
Was exactly what I wanted to ask you about next. It sounds It was a who's who of Trump world at Mar-a-Lago over the weekend for that RNC spring meeting. Tell me who was there and what can we glean from that guest list in terms of Trump's sweepstakes?
Yeah, look, I mean, you had Doug Burgum, Vivek Ramaswamy, Kristi Noem, Marco Rubio, Tim Scott. The list goes on. You have all of these potential vice presidential contenders. J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, obviously. You know, when we talk about Kristi Noem, look, I think the conventional wisdom states that, you know, her chances of being vice president could, be very slim to none right now due to the sort of the fallout from her writing about how she shot her puppy, and sort of digging into that claim and suggesting in an interview over the weekend that President Biden should shoot his own dog or put his own dog down. So it's a number of negative headlines for her over what seems like really an unforced error. So I think that kind of moves the spotlight over to, the positive spotlight, I should say, because she's very much in the negative spotlight, but over to other figures like Vance, like Rubio, Burgum, Tim Scott, Elise Stefanik, for example. These are all names you're going to hear in the run-up to Trump's announcement.
Sticking with, though, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem for just a second. She's obviously drawn a lot of headlines in the past week. There was a story about her dog, and now there's this weird story about her saying she met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, which isn't actually true. CBS's Margaret Brennan pushed her on this topic pretty hard on Sunday. Take a listen.
Did you meet Kim Jong-un?
Well, as soon as this was brought to my attention, I certainly made some changes and looked at this passage. And I've met with many, many world leaders. I've traveled around the world. As soon as it was brought to my attention, we went forward and have made some edits.
Yeah, so first off, a pretty bizarre story right there. Her saying she met with the North Korean leader, not actually true. The publisher now taking it out of her book. But B, is she toast now for Trump's sweepstakes? I know you mentioned this before, but I mean, her stock was so high. Has that just totally plummeted?
It was. Look, before all of this and last year and earlier this year during the Republican debates, it was interesting because she bought airtime in a number of these debates on major networks talking about South Dakota, come to South Dakota where we have a great economy, et cetera, and was very much front and center and positioned herself that way. But between the puppy story and the Kim Jong-un story, it's just misstep after misstep for her. And she's continuing to go on this publicity tour and seemingly stepping in it. I mean, I can't see, I could be wrong, but it's hard for me to see President Trump looking at her and getting this negative media attention and thinking, oh, that could be a good pick for me at this point. We'll see what happens. Anything is possible. We know that the two are very much allies, and she has proven herself to be very loyal to the former president. But I think there are other candidates with far less baggage that seem to be more savvy, at least when it comes to public relations, than Kristi Noem.
Yeah, and let's not forget, Kristi Noem is the one who put out this book. She is the one who put the information in that book. She publishes herself. Really fascinating how this is all played out. Julia, one more question for you. We've spoken a lot about how the issue of abortion will play into the November elections, both the presidential race and House and Senate contests. It seems like Democrats now are trying to use the wind behind their back from 2022 to flip Florida from red to blue. You have new reporting on this. Tell us about it.
Look, Democrats, at least publicly, say Florida is winnable. However, when you talk to Democrats more so privately, they're a bit less optimistic. There's more of a strategy at play when it comes to the national map. Sort of make Republicans spend more money than they initially thought they would in Florida. And by Republicans, I mainly mean President Trump and incumbent Senator Rick Scott. And that could, handicap them or prevent them from spending as much money as they wanted to in swing states like Montana, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. But Democrats and abortion rights advocates are rightfully very optimistic about the ballot measure Amendment 4 in Florida that would enshrine abortion rights in that state's constitution. Polls show that 60% of Floridians want this to be passed. So that would put theoretically them over the 60% threshold to pass that amendment. The issue for Democrats, though, is that Florida is still a red-leaning state, similar to Ohio, which also enshrined abortion rights in its state constitution, but still has the majority of statewide elected Republicans. So it's very plausible that a voter could go out and vote for Donald Trump and Rick Scott, but at the same time vote to enshrine abortion rights in the state's constitution. Democrats are going to try to prevent that from happening, but it's unclear if they'll be able to.
Fascinating to see how it plays out. Julia Manchester, national politics reporter with The Hill. I know you'll be on it. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Michael.
The Israeli military ordered around 100,000 Palestinians to evacuate the city of Rafah near Gaza's border with Egypt. That's ahead of Israel's looming invasion of the city. More than 1 million Palestinians are sheltering there. Some of Israel's closest allies are warning against the operation, including the U.S. The United Nations agency serving Palestinian refugees said it would not comply with the evacuation order. Meantime, the Biden administration stopped a shipment of ammunition bound for Israel last week. According to a report from CNN, the decision was unrelated to U.S. opposition to the invasion of Rafah. The National Security Council said in a statement that the move did not signal that the administration's backing of Israel has changed. Shifting gears now, Columbia University announced on Monday that it would be canceling its main commencement ceremony and holding smaller ceremonies for each of its colleges. It comes after weeks of protests on the campus and a nearly week-long campus lockdown since police cleared Hamilton Hall from protesters. Meantime, protests continue on campuses across the country. On Saturday, 25 protesters were arrested for trespassing at the University of Virginia, and protesters interrupted commencement ceremonies at Michigan University. Boeing is set to reach a significant milestone this week, launching its first crewed mission of its Starliner spacecraft. The mission, a decade in the making, will launch 2 NASA astronauts into orbit, hoping to prove the spacecraft is worthy of taking crew to and from the International Space Station. The flight will be used to conduct a series of tests, which include the crew briefly taking over the controls of the autonomous spacecraft and evaluating how the vehicle operates. Success is key for Boeing's space flight program and the company overall after a string of major incidents surrounding its 737 MAX 9.
Today, I am announcing my intention to seek another term. These are very difficult times for our country and the world. And in many ways, this 2024 election is the most consequential election in our lifetimes.
And finally, are you feeling the burn? Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders announced he is running for re-election. Sanders, the second oldest member of the upper chamber, announced in a statement that, quote, "We must fight to make sure that we have a government which represents the working families of our country, not the billionaire class and wealthy campaign contributors." He also used his re-election statement to denounce funding for Israel, saying the U.S. tax dollars should not be going to Netanyahu to continue its war against Hamas. The Vermont Independent has served more than 40 years in public office and will more than likely keep his seat. Sanders has won all 3 of his Senate races, including his 2018 contest, by a 40-point margin. And that's all for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Mychael Schnell. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.